Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our briefing on New Leaders, Old Problems, U.S. Policy Towards Asia. I'm Caitlin Poling. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Foreign Policy Initiative. If you're not terribly familiar with the Foreign Policy Initiative, we were founded in 2009. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, or as Robert likes to call it, think tank. Our board members include Bob Kagan, Bill Kristol, Dan Senor, and Eric Edelman, and we're focused on promoting in a militarily, diplomatically, and economically engaged America abroad. So with that, that's kind of our organization. If you're interested in learning more, please visit foreignpolicyi.org. I hope you all got the handouts outside. One that I would like to highlight really quick is a letter that we sent earlier this week to the leadership of both the House and Senate on the sequester, urging them to come up with a solution to halt the sequester. Right now we're up to 70 signers, and those include national security leaders such as former Senator Joe Lieberman, former Senator Talent, former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, and former Secretary of Defense Gates, just a number of other notable people. So please check that out. Before I turn it over to Chris, first I want to thank the Congressional China Caucus for co-hosting this event with us. So Representative Forbes and Bordallo, thank you very much for helping us out. And then I'm just going to turn it over really quick to Robert Zarate, our Policy Director, who's going to tell you about an event that we'll be hosting next week.
If you like this Asia event, just to let you know too, on the 25th February, we're going to have an event after North Korea and Iran. How much more say should Congress have on U.S. nuclear exports? And just given the fact that Iran and North Korea are in sort of dangerous nuclear zones, is that going to start arms races for nuclear capability elsewhere? And how do we control that dynamic? And I guess we want to interview Chris. And so turn over now to Chris for the event. We're all here for it. So thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Bobby. Welcome, everyone, and thanks again to the Congressional China Caucus for organizing this event. My name is Chris Griffin. I joined the Foreign Policy Initiative at the beginning of this month. Prior to that, I had the pleasure of working for Joe Lieberman of Connecticut. I was with him for about 4 years, 4.5, counting months, even days, if you count. Was a wonderful opportunity. One of the things when I was at FPI, when I was at Lieberman's office, I was a consumer, like you all are, of think tank products, of news, trying to find the best analysis, trying to find what little time our schedules allow to get the information we need. The role that FBI hopes that we can play is to go out to the broader community of think tanks and foreign policy thinkers, find the best analysis, and sometimes we believe that we're going to create it, and other times we want to just find it and help bring it to you as those who are advising the decision makers. And in that vein, I'm incredibly honored to be sitting up here with Randy Schreiber and Sean Brimley, who are speakers this afternoon. Randy is the President and CEO of the Project 2049 Institute. He is also a Senior Associate at CSIS. He has had a long career in government, in and out of government, I suppose, before coming to his current positions. He served in multiple roles in the Department of Defense, was Senior Country Director for China, Taiwan, Mongolia, was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Pacific Affairs, and also served as Chief of Staff along the way to then Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. Sean has also had a career in and out of government and is currently Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security, an organization that he was present at the creation of in 2007 before traveling to the Department of Defense to be a special assistant, if I didn't angle term, to then Deputy Secretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy, and has since served in the National Security Council. So you couldn't have two better speakers to describe, we have a very broad topic here, Asia, right, the biggest piece of Earth. But that stated, that to sort of open up a broad topic, and then would be interested to get into your specific questions, that what do the two of you see as the major developments in Asia that as folks advising members of Congress or the Senate should be aware of? What opportunities do you see for the United States, and to what degree are we or are we not exploiting those opportunities? And then we'll move to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I want to thank FPI for this opportunity. It's a wonderful crowd that's gathered here, and I want to congratulate Chris on getting off to a great start with FPI. I'm sure he's missed up here, but he'll still obviously be active and playing an important role from this new perch. Chris gave us a near impossible task, talk about the challenges and opportunities in Asia in 7 to 12 minutes. So given the magnitude of what's going on and the range of issues we could talk about, I think we can only give sort of a brief, very top-level overview of some of the most important things as we see them, at least. And so I'll endeavor to do that. And let me start out by saying I think the big question, the big issue that you hear when you travel around the region, and I think we don't have to necessarily be guided by what our friends, allies, and others are saying, but it's a good indicator of what's on people's minds, is what will happen with the so-called pivot now in the second term of the Obama administration. I'm going to use the word pivot because despite all the efforts to call it rebalancing or other things, the president keeps saying pivot. So if it's good enough for President Obama, it's good enough for me. As I see it, the administration laid out a pretty bold concept. It's one that I think has bipartisan support. I know my friends who are Asianists on the Republican side very much welcomed discussion of giving Asia a greater place of priority, doing a range of things, military, diplomatic, economically, to try to support being more active in the region. But it seems to me we've sort of got to a point where people are asking the questions about specificity and what does the pivot really mean and what is this really going to look like and how does the administration intend to implement it. And I think this is very important to give some consideration to, because if you think about it, one of the worst case scenarios would be to announce a very bold concept, get your allies to buy into it and start thinking about their role in it, all the while creating anxiety and nervousness in Beijing, and then not be able to fulfill commitments and pledges and sort of backslide from the original concepts. So that being what I think is probably one of the worst case scenarios, I think there's an important role for the Congress to play, to ask these questions in your role of providing oversight. What are the very concrete, specific things you intend to do to implement this? And I think some of them, some of the questions are quite obvious. The defense budget and what that really means for force structure in the Asia Pacific, and Sean knows far more about this than I do. But at some level, that's a number that's it's very public, recognizable, and something that this will be measured against. The strategic guidance that the Obama administration came out with in 2011, which said 60% of our forces will be in the Asia Pacific, that sounds great, but you can get to 60% in a lot of different ways. You can just cut elsewhere, and you can ultimately get to 60% in Asia. And if that's the means for doing it, that'll be unsatisfactory, I think, to a lot of our allies and friends. So budgetary issues are very big, and how you actually plan a force structure to support this greater involvement and attention in Asia. Trade, I think, remains an outstanding question. The administration is committed to the TPP, at least committed to the negotiation. But all the while, there's a lot of activity going on around us, bilateral FTAs with other countries, mini-lateral FTAs, and we're not in the game. We have one play, which is TPP. And I know trade can be a controversial issue on Capitol Hill, but I got to say, from an Asianist perspective, this is really the lifeblood of the region. And if you're not in the game, you're not fully part of the life and fabric of Asia. And TPP, in my view, is just a start. These are 10 economies which are significant, but in fact, the two largest economies in Asia are still out, Japan and China. And so we need, in my view, to think about a strategy that is a little bit more aggressive on the trade front, trade liberalization. Because again, when I think of longer-term sort of worst-case scenarios, the worst-case scenario is we provide the security guarantees and sort of underscore regional peace and stability through our forward presence of military forces, and then China comes in and sweeps in all the trade deals and the economic benefits. That's not a very satisfying arrangement from my point of view. But we can't stop China from their diplomacy and their outreach and trying to secure their own trade deals. We can only compete with deals of our own and try to make our trade relationships stronger. So ultimately, there are a range of questions that I think need to be asked with respect to the pivot and its implementation. And I personally also have questions about the people that will be driving this. I happen to think people in government matter. You know, maybe that sounds self-serving, but perhaps it's self-serving for all of us since we're all playing these roles. And I think a lot of the energy and the intellectual investment in this came from people like Kurt Campbell. Certainly Secretary Clinton deserves a lot of credit. Will Secretary Kerry have the same kind of commitment? He seems, by orientation, to be a little bit more of a Europeanist and think about the Middle East. And to be sure, there are issues that are important there. But who will be the people that are really driving this implementation forward of the so-called pivot? So I think questions there and just things to keep an eye on. Other challenges, you know, we could spend hours, if not days, talking about just China and challenges associated with the U.S.-China relationship, China's role in the region. But let me just mention a couple to keep an eye on. You know, I think there are growing concerns about stability inside China. And, you know, we've just gone through a political transition. Things look relatively smooth on the outside. But I'm actually kind of bearish on the Chinese economy and a bit concerned about stability there. We've gotten a bit complacent in the analytical community to think that the key for the leadership to stay in power and to sustain their position is to secure 8 to 10% economic growth every year. Well, that's only true if sustaining economic growth doesn't threaten the party or come at the expense of the key stakeholders within the party. And I'm of the view that the kinds of reforms that are very necessary in China to promote economic growth are exactly the kind of reforms that are going to threaten the party and some of the key stakeholders. So I think they're going to face some very difficult choices. Do we go forward with state-owned enterprise reform, which I think they have to do to be economically competitive? But at the same time, are they willing to literally take money out of the pockets of the senior members of the Communist Party of China, friends, relatives who have grown quite healthy on these proceedings from state-owned enterprises? And so you see where I'm sort of headed with this. It may not be the case going forward that economic growth is the key to stability of the Communist Party. It may in fact threaten their stability and their position. And that brings in a whole new proposition of how the party maintains power. And I suspect they would go in the direction of a heavier hand, human rights issues getting worse, and a projection outward of their problems. The Chinese leaders in Beijing don't like to be criticized or blamed for the problems. They like to blame it on the Japanese, on the United States, and others. So this aggressive foreign policy, assertive foreign policy we're seeing from Beijing, I think could only get worse if my calculations, my forecasts are correct about their stability. Let me also mention, since I know it's an issue of great interest here right now on Capitol Hill, are the cyber issues. And again, you can spend hours talking about this. But let me just leave you with a couple thoughts. As bad as you think it is, you've probably all experienced intrusions and problems with your computers and issues, and as bad as you think it is, let me just tell you that I am confident it's worse. And it's worse in not only magnitude, but the central question about who is responsible for this. I am convinced we're going to come out with more and more information that this is government and party-directed, state involvement, PLA military involvement, and that, I think, will sort of create tensions in the U.S.-China relationship, because a lot of the Chinese narrative that they've been promoting is, you know, sort of these rogue hackers and young, underemployed, recent college grads who go to the internet cafes and just create mischief. The New York Times is about to come out with a story on the attacks that they've been suffering since they ran the cover story of Wen Jiabao's family getting rich, profiting from his government positions, and they're going to bring it down to an address in a particular building. And oh, by the way, that's an address in a particular building that my institute identified months ago as being associated with the PLA Second Department. So this is going to get more and more interesting, but I suspect, again, it's going to get harder for all of us because China's not going to be able to say they're unwitting. They're not going to be able to suggest there's no state imprimatur for a lot of these activities. So I think that puts a burden on the administration and you folks on Capitol Hill. A couple other issues to mention, just because it's in the news and a lot of attention related to the nuclear test in Korea. Again, hours and hours could be devoted to this, but let me just leave one thought. The only approach that I've seen gain traction and somewhat, let me use the air quotes here, work against North Korea is when we led a very intensive effort in the first term of the Bush administration to crack down on the palace economy, to target sanctions at the very senior leaders of the People's Workers' Party, including the top individuals, cracking down on illegal and illicit activities that they're profiting from, and really hurt them personally as individuals through financial means. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post this weekend suggesting we should return to that. I think that has to be part of the solution because, frankly, I've just seen this movie one too many times. Provocation followed by payoff and reward, followed by some period of calm, followed by more provocation. Because when you've got a pretty limited toolkit to draw from, and you've been taught that provocation works, we're just going to see more and more of it again. Unless we change or augment. I mean, we've got to continue to talk about denuclearization, but I think augmenting that through more targeted financial sanctions against the individuals and more robust counter-proliferation efforts because we can't allow the North Korean regime to proliferate. I should mention maritime and territorial disputes, also very hot in Asia. You can talk about South China Sea, you can talk about East China Sea and the dispute over the Senkakus and the Diaoyutai. Let me just leave you with a thought here that I think this is getting incredibly dangerous. There are no rules of the road safety protocols in place for the Japanese and the Chinese and others as they involve themselves, like even the ROC in the Senkakus area recently. They're operating in very close proximity to one another with great frequency, and it's a dangerous operating environment. On top of that, if there is an incident, there is no mechanism for crisis communication, crisis management. So this is a very dangerous mix. When the Chinese introduced air activity to this situation, it shortened the timelines for decision-making to a mere seconds. When they actually lit up, as we say, the military painted one of the Japanese surface vessels, under our ROE, we could have fired upon that vessel without any higher authority than the captain of that ship. That's how dangerous this is getting. So we need to keep an eye on this, and I hope the administration is promoting not only diplomacy and creative diplomacy, and I think they've tried things like sending the group of former officials, my boss, Richard Armitage, was a part of that, but to think about what that means for the U.S.-Japan alliance and others in terms of preparing. So a number of challenges. I just ticked off a few there. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about at least a couple of opportunities and things that are more positive. I think there are some opportunities in front of us with respect to the U.S.-Japan alliance, things that we've been pushing for quite some time to deal with some of the constraints on the alliance and put us in a better position to deal with some of the possible contingencies we could face in the region and to deal with things that are not just sort of conflict related, but related to peace and stability in the region, maritime security and HHDR and the like. There is a short-term obstacle here, which is we finally got a government that is willing to embrace this approach, but at the same time they have a tendency to speak in ways about history and about the region that makes others very uncomfortable. So there's a short-term tension here, and my concern is the administration will not fully embrace the agenda that we've actually been pushing Japan towards for decades, for fear that it will cause more anxiety in Korea, more anxiety in China. So if that's the response from the U.S. administration, I think that will hurt our chances for progress. I hope they'll continue to say, let's look at strengthening the alliance, let's look at collective self-defense, let's look at these things. And while at the same time, out of necessity, dealing with some of the more sensitive issues related to history and so forth. I think there are opportunities related to strengthening the U.S.-Japan ROK alliance. We can thank our friends in Pyongyang and Beijing for those opportunities. But it's raised awareness, it's raised consciousness. We have a new administration in Tokyo and one coming in Seoul. And I think new administrations give us a new opportunity to strengthen that relationship. So I look at that as an opportunity. I think alliance capacity building in general, if you look at our treaty allies and friends in like-minded countries, there's a lot of nervousness about the trajectory of China. And ultimately, you don't want your policies entirely driven out of fear and anxiety of the People's Republic of China. But on the other hand, it's a good opportunity to tap into that and suggest that there are some things that our friends and allies can do that will help us in the region. Maritime domain awareness, helping us develop a common operating picture among all the countries that would likely fight together in the case of a contingency in the region. Last opportunity I want to mention is related to India. You know, India's had a look east policy for decades now, and I always hasten to add that it's a look east, not due east policy. Well, they've been looking for an awfully long time, and I think there are probably opportunities to draw them into the activities of the region in ways that are more consequential and more active, that go beyond just looking and giving consideration to the region. Because it is very important to India, but bringing them into a variety of regional fora, alliance activities that we have going on, the economic aspects, I would strongly encourage an FTA with India. These are the kinds of things that I think would really help, because India ultimately, I think, will be a like-minded country when it comes to important security and economic issues in the region. I've probably gone over time. If I could just say a word or two about the role of Congress here. I think all of these issues that I've laid out do require your constant oversight. But I would just encourage you to be active. Having sat at OSD, having sat as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, you may be surprised if you haven't served in the executive branch what a single phone call from a Hill staffer can do. And my sense is that it kind of ebbs and flows. There are periods of activity and then periods where it gets a little more quiet. And I think that's highly dependent on the individuals, personally, unless somebody would explain to me otherwise. And I think being active, getting out there, making the calls, asking questions about these issues and others has a very healthy effect on the administration. It's a bit like testifying. I was saying I like facing this way rather than that way. But testifying before the Congress really helps focus the mind. Nothing like fear of public humiliation to make you want to get your ducks in order. You can have the same effect as Hill staff, just asking questions and just showing interest and showing that you want to be constructive. You know, probably, and here's where I'll end, probably the most common question I get in Asia right now, beyond is there anything to this pivot, is, you know, who are our go-to people on Capitol Hill going to be? Danny Inouye is gone, Lugar, Webb, all the people that people in the region associate with Asia are mostly gone. And you know, we can all come up with a list, I think. And I think most people are looking at Congressman Royce. And he's got a history there. But a lot of people who are potentially leaders on Asian issues in the House or the Senate are people without a lot of history and a lot of background to it. So they have to develop that interest. They have to show through their actions that they want to be a leader on these issues. And I think that the field is very open. So if you have a member that wants to step up, I think it would be well received in the region and probably in the administration. They're probably asking the same questions. Who do we deal with and who do we go to on that? So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. Sean?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Randy. I think I'll be briefer in part because Randy said not a single thing that I truly disagree with. A, and B, you know, his expertise in Asia is far more deep than mine. I sort of had the mile wide, inch deep experience in government. But let me just say a couple things to satisfy Chris's requests of us. I agree. I think maritime tensions in the South and East China Sea are probably the thing that scares me the most, in part because, as Randy described, what I worry about is miscalculation. I don't really worry necessarily about, you know, a senior party official or some strategy from China, you know, some choice that sparks a conflict. I worry about, you know, a fishing vessel. I worry about, you know, decisions at the tactical level that can spiral very quickly. We saw this, I remember being at the White House and we saw the Scarborough Shoal incident with the Filipinos and China. And that was disturbing to me anyway, because we had this sense that things could spiral quickly out of control, and it would be hours or days before it could meaningfully affect things on the ground. And part of what concerns me a little is, and this brings me to one of the other issues that I'm following, is China's played its cards so badly, in my view, that we really now have the reemergence of some core allies and partners in Southeast Asia in ways we probably didn't 4 or 5 years ago. I'm thinking particularly of the Philippines, but also states like Vietnam, even Indonesia and Thailand. But from my perspective, one of the concerns here is we want to do more. We want to build our partners in Southeast Asia. We want to do so in part. We want to be able to prevent sort of moral hazards is the wrong term. But what I worry about is becoming deeper and establishing deeper partnerships with the Philippines, for example. But we don't want to establish a partnership whereby our partners feel newly emboldened to poke the dragon in the eye necessarily, and think that the United States de facto then has skin in the game and has their back. But at the same time, we need to be pretty forward and aggressive in terms of building these partnerships. But that's one of these dynamics we're going to have to be pretty careful about moving forward. The other big structural issue, I think, in Asia that I track is the rise of India. I agree with Randy that they've had a look-east policy for a while, and we should do things, for example, with the Australians and the Singhs and Japan, to bring them further into multilateral organizations. Part of the problem is a U.S. government problem, frankly. When I was at the White House, even at the NSC, just think how we're organized, right? The folks who worked India at the White House, they look at India North. They're sort of in the South Asia, Central Asia directorates. And so a lot of our policy approaches tend to be looking at India in the context of South Asia, not necessarily looking at India in the context of a greater Asia. And this is where the leadership of people like Kirk Campbell, for instance, was rather inspired, because he really pushed a perspective like that. And again, a lot of this depends on personality, but just think also when you deal with the executive branch, how they are structured, and they're structured differently. In OSD policy, for instance, the DASD for Southeast Asia is also the DASD for South Asia. So he has everything from the Philippines all the way to India. So structurally, they have a different view, but state is structured differently, and so is the White House. I think a couple opportunities I'd just go very quick on. Part of the reason I think China's played its cards so badly, we have a lot of opportunity on posture issues in Southeast Asia. I remember in 2009, I was part of the team that helped convince Secretary Gates to put Marines in Darwin and to push forward on 12 combat ships in Singapore. And part of the argument there was, we basically said, we gave him 3 slides, ultimately, 3 maps. One was a map showing where we were in Asia today. One, a map showing where we ought to be perhaps in 2030. And the final map was, if you agree with that long-term vision, here are some baby steps. I think we didn't call them baby steps. It was basically low-hanging fruit. What are those small, targeted investments that you can make now that start walking you down a path to be more forward and more resident in Asia? And Darwin and Singapore were among those opportunities. But the challenge now is to articulate what the rest of those baby steps are. And I'll just be frank. I mean, I don't think the executive branch is quite. There's no long-term 10-year, 15-year plan as to how we get from these baby steps to a fully resourced pivot, rebalanced to the Asia Pacific. And I think this is part of the role that Congress can play in asking those questions. As Randy, I'm sure, will agree. When you're in government, it's hard to look beyond the tactical. At the White House, next month is highly strategic. There's no 6 1-year, 1.5 2-year plans, and that's part of the reason why I think think tanks in Congress can help set the context for a lot of this stuff. I think trade is another opportunity for us. I mean, I'm pleased at TPP. I'm pleased at the free trade agreement with Korea, but I think we need follow-on here. There needs to be a lot of pressure. I worry a little bit that a lot of the defense posture, rebalance issues. I'm pleased at all of it, but we need, I'm worried that the defense can't be so ahead of the curve. We need to have all our instruments of statecraft fully alongside. And it's part of the reason why Secretary Clinton, before she left, really seized on economic statecraft and gave a series of speeches, and in fact brought some people on to do that. But I think that's an area of focus where I think we need to keep the attention span there. And finally, I'll just talk a little bit about the congressional perspective. I think you ought to insist on a strategy. I think as we get into the QDR cycle, as we get up to a QDDR at state, and frankly a national security strategy cycle, all that planning is starting right now. And as we get to June, July, August, into the fall, a lot of the superstructure of those big quadrennial reviews will be well underway. And I know there's hearings starting up on the HASC anyway on the QDR, but I would encourage all of you to think about, now's the time to affect the terms of reference, the structural, the decision-making, the analytic engine rooms of all of these reviews. So it would be helpful, if you think about Asia and rebalancing, to try to think about how you can leverage these processes from your perspectives to get those insights into that structure. Part of that is, I think we ought to develop metrics for the rebalancing, or metrics for the pivot. So for instance, when I was at the White House, one of the things I did before we left was we did some work in this space of how would you articulate an Asia rebalancing strategy that you could lock in for a long period of time. Think 10 years, think 15 years. What are those things we ought to be measuring year after year? Is it port visits? Is it exercises? I actually think it's things like, how many FSOs has state hired for Asia Pacific? How much money are you spending in the Foreign Language Institute over a period of years? I remember asking questions of the intelligence community. How many analytic positions have you hired for the Asia Pacific in FY13 versus FY12 versus FY11? And it was very difficult to get answers at that level of specificity, but I think that's a perfect role for Congress to play. I mean, I think you could articulate 10, 11, 12 core metrics for Asia rebalancing, or Asia pivot, that you would track year after year after year after year as a means to actually affect the resourcing of the strategy. And finally, I just end on a similar point. I think it's very important to think about Asia rebalancing, the Asia pivot, as a decade-plus strategy, right? We need to think about what are those small investments that we can make year after year after year that over time will aggregate to something truly meaningful, rather than going for that big structural decision now. This is, and I think as Randy would agree, and as he said, this is relatively a bipartisan consensus on the basics of the need to focus on the Asia Pacific. And so we need to think in that term. I mean, I hesitate to bring up things like NSC 68 because I don't think that the situation is entirely different. But in some ways, you go back and read some of the early Cold War strategies, and they had that long-term view. This is a decades-long process. We need to think in that time scale for our strategy in Asia. Maybe I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you both for this ball out of the park in terms of initial presentations. We'll use the prerogative of the moderator and start out with a question and then open it up more broadly. There's lots of substance here to touch on, obviously, and Randy described it's an impossible task to touch it all in 7 to 12 minutes. I'm sure that a lot of folks here would be really happy if their bosses gave them 7 to 12 minutes to talk about Asia, which is one of the huge challenges that we face. As a former Hill staffer, and either of you have served on the Hill? One of the challenges in interacting with the executive branch is there's often this sense coming back from the executive that who are these guys? If I wait, they will go away. That this member is suddenly interested for some reason. I don't know why. That there's a lack of energy sometimes in responding to legislature. It can be a real hassle back and forth. I'm just kind of curious, when you look at, we sort of have a toolkit that we can use. You can do staff outreach, try to call somebody. You can do questions for the record. You can try to get a member of it. You can try to organize a hearing. You have the ability to. That you can do requirements, and you can mandate a study, you can do that, et cetera. And you touched on this, Sean. Would just be curious in terms of like that toolkit. What have you seen that's effective for engaging the executive? And secondly, one thing that you didn't touch on is that the role of looking at legislative action and congressional action, not just going through the executive, but also having the ability to directly engage. You didn't mention that some in terms of directly engaging with Asian countries and partners. We're curious when you look at statements
resolutions, that do those make a difference in your perspective? Something happens in the world, there's a House or Senate resolution addressing it. The President says that he wants to have a successful rebalance. Even if you don't have money moving around, you have resolutions speaking to it, speaking to TPP, letters, that the role of all these things, that when you're a staffer, takes a lot of time to do, doesn't matter.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it does matter. I think all of the above. I remember any number of things that you mentioned. I can think of instances where either at the Pentagon, when I was working for Michelle Flournoy, or at the White House. I know Congressman Forbes' staff, I think, helped with this event. I mean, I worked with some of his staffers for years now on Navy force structure issues, even at the White House. And that just built on personal relationships that I've developed over a period of time. That's probably the most important thing, I would think, is just spend that time. I can't think of a single instance where over 4 years in government I had a staff member from Congress email me or call me that I didn't respond to immediately or meet with. No, I'm sure there are people in the executive branch who ignore that kind of stuff. I think there are a lot of us who don't, because we recognize that it's like a force multiplier, really. And you'd be surprised. There are a lot of people inside the executive branch who really would love to have formal interaction with Congress as a means to increase their own bargaining leverage on the inside. I see Randy nodding. I'm sure he agrees. I think I just wouldn't be shy. I just wouldn't be shy at all. If there's an issue you're passionate about, build those networks, and you'll be surprised how an email here or a telephone call there can actually aggregate into meaningful influence.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm sure I'll say something here that will offend somebody somewhere. But, we used to look at our Legis Affairs offices in OSD and the State Department as people to be circumvented and avoided if at all possible. And I'm being a little glib here. Obviously, they can play a helpful role for both sides in terms of being facilitators and helping identify your priorities, our priorities. But too often, Legis Affairs can become obstacles to developing those relationships. And so I always, from the executive side, put a lot of importance on developing personal relationships. Part of that is it's sort of tactical. You're increasing your leverage. You're playing defense. The last thing you need is another reporting requirement or to be hauled up for a hearing. So wouldn't this be better if I just told you everything I know over a beer or something? But if you invest in those relationships over time, you gain influence and leverage. And, it's a very human thing. You want to do things to help your colleagues that you like and respect. And, when you have that, when it comes to that point in time where you do have something really important, if you have that person in your Rolodex, that can be very valuable. And I would say on the second part of your question, I think, and I know we have some friends from the diplomatic community here, I think there is that interest in knowing which members are going to step up and be leaders on Asia-Pacific security issues. If it's just sort of a letter here, a statement there, and it doesn't seem very sort of well-organized and sustained, then it probably won't have a lot of punch. But if there are people who, over a period of time have a track record of visiting, of making statements, letters, and all that, they'll start to be seen as, well, this person really cares, is really interested. And all our friends and allies and others, they want to know who the go-to people are. So I would say if from the staff level you can direct your member in that direction, again, I think it's an entirely open field right now in terms of who's going to be the congressional voices of greatest consequence on Asia.
Great. Open it up for questions, and just please state who you are and who you work for.
Jason Goodale, I work in Congressman Thornberry's office. A bit broader question, but given that this is going to be a long process and a strategic shift over many decades, you guys had referenced naval hostilities or provocative behavior in the region as being very dangerous, whereas in other places, i.e. North Africa and the Middle East right now, we have active hostilities that are going on. Why is Asia more important than those areas, and why do we need to start leaning into the Pacific?
Well, I think you should be careful, not you, we should all be careful to say that, making Asia a greater priority shouldn't be at the expense of some of our most important security challenges, and the near term is always going to, require your attention. But look, the way I would answer your question, look at any objective measure you want to try to look at. Populations, use of energy, size of militaries, size of the economies, emissions, you name it, the center of gravity of all human activity is moving to the Asia-Pacific region. If you count the United States as a Pacific, which I do, and India as looking east, 56% of the world's population. Energy use is over 60% in this region. 8 out of 10 of the world's largest militaries are in this region. Something like 80% of the world's commerce flows through the maritime areas of the region. And again, any objective measure, this is where it's happening. So again, you don't want to sort of, the imagery of pivot, if you're thinking about it, I guess it's a basketball term, you could look at somebody pivoting away from something else rather quickly. That's probably the incorrect imagery. You want to think about, over the longer term, how to position yourself to be influential and powerful in this region that's going to matter so much for all these reasons. And, oh, by the way, just to add a wrinkle to all of this, there's another country that may not completely share our interests and values that is vying for power and influence in the Asia-Pacific region. So,
yeah, I really don't have much to add to that. I entirely agree. But this is part of the challenge, right? I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion necessarily about Syria, but I personally tend to look at situations like that in the context of our global strategy, right? I mean, and as a defense wonk, I tend to think in terms of strategic and operational risk, right? I mean, what level of risk are we willing to accept over the very long term in order to resource a long-term strategy in the Asia-Pacific? Part of it is going to be accepting a greater risk, of potentially not acting in situations where we would otherwise think about acting. I'm not saying that's necessarily Syria, but I think when things like North Africa come up, Mali, Syria, I'd even put Libya in this category. Part of the decision calculus for policymakers on Capitol Hill, but also in the White House, is going to be, if I'm considering the use of force, or if I'm considering a big decision that has strategic implications, that, oh, by the way, will have second and third order effects that I don't fully control, I don't fully have agency over, how does that put at risk my long-term need to rebalance the Asia-Pacific? And that's part of the statecraft equation that I think is going to be a prominent issue, like I said, for a decade or more.
If I could just quickly add to that, one thing that comes to mind in that regard is that credibility is fungible, and military force in its own way is fungible. And I don't think that a successful rebalance or pivot would involve showing we're no longer credible in this part of the world, but we are now. I think that's clearly a message that you can't send. I think that remember back a few years ago, a comment from an official in Asia to the effect of that Iraq has to come to a relatively successful outcome, or you're going to lose credibility in your security commitments to us. And that this is something that there really isn't a mutual exclusivity between being effective and leading in one part of the world and in another. It's a question of making the investments to be effective in the nation.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Johnson. I'm from the Committee on Homeland Security. Both of you guys talked about economic statecraft and the importance of trade. And how can the government interact with leaders of private businesses and business leaders to encourage that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's an element that is relatively under-resourced. I personally didn't spend that much time on working those issues. I mean, when I was working at DoD, some of these things would come up, and it would always be like an add-on to something else. I think that's part of the reason Secretary Clinton got animated about this issue towards the end of her tenure, talking about economic statecraft. So hopefully there's more to come in this respect. And even at the White House, I'm thinking now, part of the way we organize is we tend to hive off and stovepipe. Although, so the National Economic Council, National Security Council, OMB, we probably need to think about the architecture of our bureaucracies in a way that can enable this kind of activity, because it's not currently set up that way.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you a good answer, other than to say that I think it is sort of underappreciated and underutilized. I think there's probably a role for the government to leverage our business community more, because the brand power, the sort of the face of what's beneficial about having a relationship with the United States. A lot of that is through our private sector, and then, of course, having the business community support government endeavors in trade liberalization. It's mutually beneficial. And so it probably needs to be exploited more. I would say one of the frustrations of the administration is sometimes you get a business community that only wants you when there's a problem, and they don't want to be vocal themselves. You take IPR problems in China. No company wants to be the one going to Beijing and railing against the theft of their intellectual property because they fear some sort of reprisals that would be even worse. But for the USG to go forward and talk about IPR is one thing. And then the Chinese said, we're not hearing from anybody in the business community. We're just hearing from you guys, so it must not be that serious. So I think, working more hand in glove with priorities, looking at trade liberalization, but also where the problems are, and having, business community, even if it's through business associations and organizations, having a more active vote, even on the more sensitive and controversial issues, I think would be helpful.
If I could ask you as a follow-up question on that there's, in terms of thinking about trade liberalization in Asia, and I know, Randy, the PPP is something that you follow closely, that you'll see sometimes news reports the effect of China's eating their lunch in Asia when it comes to they're doing this trade agreement, that trade agreement, that in terms of the efficacy and the depth of what we consider an FTA versus what the Chinese consider an FTA necessarily. Could either of you speak to that? And whenever we do have successful trade negotiations, how meaningful do you think those are, and how much support they should be receiving from Congress, both in terms of getting them done and ultimately getting them passed?
Well, I'm pretty unapologetic in terms of support for free trade and trade liberalization, and I see mostly upside, even though, yes, you can create in the near term, to some degree, winners and losers in the United States when you reach these deals. But on the first part of the question, the Chinese, their standards for what they call a free trade agreement are pretty low. But then again, they see it in a broader context. They see it as part of their diplomacy. They see it as part of their security strategy, is to bind countries in to the trade relationship with them more closely. And even a trade agreement that falls short of our standards can make incremental progress for them in those broader goals. And I think we need to think about trade in a little bit more in that regard than we do now. There's a saying that warfare is too important to be left to the generals and the military. And I've always thought trade policy is too important to be left to trade negotiators and trade officials. These are really strategic opportunities and strategic agreements. I think we just haven't been in the game in Asia, and there's even some skepticism on TPP. There's a little bit of a maybe it's conspiratorial, but there's sort of a cynical game going on that the administration's insistence on a gold standard 21st century trade agreement is really an excuse to not have a trade agreement that they have to actually present for agreement in the Congress. So I think this stuff is very important, and it's part of how we're going to be measured in the region because trade is so important to them.
Yeah, I can take that from a slightly different analogy, having worked on the posture stuff at DoD. I remember, fighting tooth and nail to get the commitment to put Marines in Darwin and being told, oh my gosh, it's ridiculous, it's small fry, small potatoes, doesn't mean anything, why aren't you going for like an aircraft carrier to Perth or something like that? these sort of fantastical military moves that are just totally unrealistic. But we did succeed in getting that commitment in Darwin, and the president did go to Canberra and give a speech where he said, "I've made a strategic decision as president to focus on the Asia Pacific." And it made a difference. It really was a small thing, but it was a strategic thing. And I think the necessity is to not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. I would much rather have a series of relatively small, imperfect trade agreements, relatively small, marginal operational utility posture initiatives, defense posture initiatives with rising partners in the Asia Pacific on a sort of consistent, steady tempo over a long period of time, than to hold out hope for these gold-plated defense posture moves or gold-plated trade agreements that, 9 times out of 10 aren't going to come to fruition anyway. So I'd much rather have that long-term, what did George Kennedy say, a long-term, persistent but firm approach. Next.
Gentlemen, Mike Poche from Congressman Barber's office, what DoD authorities, if any, need to be relooked or amended to, one, better support rebalance, and number two, better facilitate foreign relations?
I think he's surfing more research.
Well, you were Deputy Assistant Secretary. It's a good question. I'm not sure there are any authorities that need to be changed. It's always easy to think about it in terms of authorities. I think they probably have all the authorities they need. I think what could be helpful from a congressional perspective is just that persistent poking and attention and prodding on the rebalance issues. So whether it's asking for an annual report, whether it's insisting on a briefing talking about long-term metrics, whether it's asking for a budget briefing, asking for the what are you doing in this fiscal year in Asia versus last fiscal year? How many, how do port visits factor into your Asia Pacific strategy? Those are the kinds of things I think if you wrap a lot of those inquiries together in terms of an overall strategy from one office or from a sort of caucus perspective, that can aggregate, I think, to some meaningful influence rather than trying to figure out some new authority that they probably already have in some capacity anyway. I don't know.
I agree with that. I wouldn't have to.
Yeah, and it does seem kind of striking that, like, after the 40s, we basically created a government that can extend security commitments and can liberalize economic relations with trade partners. And there's some reasons that there's no excuse for screwing up Asia with the government that we have in contrast to many other parts of the world. Maybe another side of that question is sequestration and the out-year consequences of the Budget Control Act that at the end of the day, for dismantling the Department of Defense from the top line down, what does that do to the credibility of this policy?
Sure, I can take a crack at this and then Randy follows this stuff too. Look, I'm not a congressional expert on these things at all, and I'm not going to opine on whether sequestration happens or not. I do think it would be, it would be great to pass some sort of, legislation that allows the Secretary of Defense to have more of a scalpel than a meat axe. It may well be that these cuts are going to happen, but if there's some contingency where we can say, okay, in aggregate these cuts need to be X%, but you have some ability to use a scalpel as opposed to a sort of a meat cleaver approach. I think that would be a good thing. Another thing that worries me, this is a great book. I'm going to geek out for a second. This is a great book by an old RAND analyst named Carl Bilder. It's called Mass to War. Brian Burton's probably read this. But it talks about how each military service has its own particular culture, its own way of looking at things. And it's a great perspective. And you see over time that when the budgets start to contract, each military service will fall back on the things that are most core to their essence. So for the Army, it tends to be the size, the end strength of its forces. For the Air Force, it tends to be the best and fastest fighter jet. And for the Navy, it tends to be the size and of its surface warfare combatants. But there are a couple of things that in a very budget-constrained environment, I worry will get zeroed out. Things like significant investment in long-term carrier-based unmanned vehicles. Things like the X-47B, for instance. There are a bunch of platforms that I worry. And in fact, I've heard that the Air Force and Navy are cutting by like 30% some of their investments in these game-changing technologies. Because from my perspective, you think the A2AD environment in the Asia Pacific is bad now. I mean, you just wait 12, 15 years down the road. That's when it's going to get really sporty. And so we need to start making these investments today in order to have those platforms and to be able to lock in some competitive advantages so that when we get to that really, truly competitive A2AD environment 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to have locked in a series of advantages. And I worry that sequestration, I worry about the defense cuts, are going to really cut into those game-changing defense investments that aren't at the core of how the military services think about themselves and their strengths.
Well, I agree with all of that. I don't know that I would add too much more, but the giving them a scalpel versus a, what'd you say, sledgehammer? I mean, that's to me the real key is if you're going to have a smart strategy in Asia, you have to have the ability to make smart choices and to prioritize. And but I would add to that, I mean, there is a reputational issue here, and we'll be judged by this, not only the number, not only the bottom line, but we will be somewhat judged on the process, because if our allies look at this outcome and say, you couldn't even give us a number, you had to go with this across-the-board cut, how can we have full faith and confidence going forward? You're asking us to undertake activities for capacity building and be part of your regional strategy, deal with the rising China, and you guys can't even get a defense budget passed. There's a reputational issue there. We'll be judged by it. So I think the bottom line is important, but I think what's more important is the ability to make smart choices and to prioritize and to show other countries that we can get our act together and be part of a long-term process to deal with the challenge of a rising China.
I think I have from the Japanese embassy. Randy, you talked about the sanctions against North Korea that the Bush administration employed in its first term. Could you perhaps remind the audience of what you did vis-a-vis like Bangladesh or Asia? And also, what's your advice to the U.S. government as well as its allies that they can do to North Korea today?
Well, just very briefly, there was a decision made in the Bush administration, followed up by the formation of a task force to crack down on what was called the palace economy or the soprano economy, basically an economy run by the very elites, to include at the time Kim Jong-il, which directly benefited their own bank accounts and largely survived on a range of illegal and illicit activity, counterfeiting our currency, selling counterfeit drugs, cigarettes. If it was illegal and unsavory, the North Koreans were involved in it, smuggling ivory, just the worst stuff. And it was going directly into the bank accounts of these individuals. So using the techniques of law enforcement, probably more than anything else, more than traditional military activities, to bring about cases against these folks, and then using the elements of the Patriot Act, which allowed us to designate, probably the most high-profile case was this Banco Delta Macau case, where about 25 million, I think it was frozen. And I think it was very effective in terms of getting their attention and bringing them to the negotiating table and putting us in a better position with the North Koreans. Ultimately, it probably wasn't tried long enough to bring it to some sort of satisfactory conclusion. Because